Hello and welcome to my Park Chan-Wook tier list. Today we are ranking 10 Park Chan-Wook projects. Starting off with JSA, aka Joint Security Area. If you don't know, Joint Security Area refers to the sort of DMZ, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. That's what this JSA is referring to. JSA is his first film that is accessible to people outside of South Korea, it would seem. He has 2 feature films before this, but I cannot for the life of me track them down. I looked high and low for them. They don't even have many ratings on IMDb, so I think they're just pretty hard to find if you're not living in South Korea. Maybe even then, they're kind of hard to find, who knows. JSA is his first accessible film, and you can definitely see a sort of progression from JSA onward throughout the rest of his career. JSA is already featuring a couple of actors who he would work with again later on. You have Kang Ho-sung, who of course was very present in my Bong Joon-ho tier list. If you haven't seen that, check that out now. And check out my other tier list. I got a bunch of them. There will be a playlist in the description and on the end screen at the end. And Lee Byung-hun, who he would work with again in his segment of 3 Extremes. JSA is a little bit more of a slow burn than some of his other films. It starts off with a sort of a little bit more Americanized feeling, actually, despite the fact that it's a very South Korean story, or a very North and South Korean story. It feels a little like A Few Good Men for the whole beginning of the movie. That's kind of the vibe it gets. And there are some elements in here that just do not work. There's some English language dialogue that is awful. It doesn't work. The delivery is poor, which you can't really blame the actor too much because it's clearly not their first language. But also it's like the worst written dialogue in the movie, and it just doesn't really need to be there. You could chop it out of the movie. There's that, and there's this framing device of this American involvement, and I would guess that involvement is there to try to help the film reach a broader audience. But I say strip all that out of the movie, and you have a much stronger piece of work overall. JSA, though, it's still great. It really is. It takes a little while till you start seeing more of that Park Chan-Wook style that we all love, if you're a fan of him as well. His stylistic flourishes are a little more toned down in this than in some of his later projects, but they are still there in certain sequences. What this really hinges on, though, are the 2 lead performances from Kang Ho-sung, who is playing a North Korean soldier, and Lee Byung-hun, who is playing the South Korean soldier. If those 2 performances weren't excellent, this film would not work, but luckily they are fucking excellent. They are great. Their individual performances are excellent, but also they have just such good chemistry with each other. It's a film about camaraderie, this brotherhood that these 2 guys form. Really what it is a beautiful story of friendship disguised as a DMZ thriller. And JSA came out at an interesting time for South Korean cinema as a whole. South Korean cinema was still kind of finding its footing. It wasn't quite the powerhouse that it is today. I would call it an influential film for sure. JSA is very good. You can make a case for A or B. I'm going to put it in B because there are some rocky stuff. The English dialogue and that framing device do hurt it. Otherwise, I'd say it's an A tier if you could strip that stuff out. Maybe a director's cut would be an A tier. Next up, we have Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. Now, this is the start of the Vengeance trilogy. If you didn't know, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, Oldboy, and Lady Vengeance are all part of a sort of very loosely connected trilogy. Really, the only connection is that there are 3 movies made by Park Chan-Wook all about vengeance. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is the first of the trilogy, and I would say the least high profile for whatever reason. Oldboy is definitely the most famous because it has the iconic hammer scene, and it has really wormed its way into the zeitgeist. It got an American remake and all that, which fuck that American remake. I'm not going to say anything about it beyond that. The American remake is dog shit. Do not waste your time with it. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is excellent. I'm going to be saying that about a lot of these movies, but it really is. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, the first time I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, that's really good. Every time I've rewatched it, it just gets better and better and better. It's really a film that can grow on you with each subsequent rewatch. Kang Ho-sung's performance gets better every rewatch. His performance is so subtle in this one. It's very different. Again, like all of his performances, it's very different from all of his other performances. He's also in Lady Vengeance, by the way, in a really tiny little cameo where I don't think he even has any lines. He might have a line or 2. He's like a thug. I think he's even credited as thug or gangster or something like that, and he just smacks someone around a little bit. It's the kind of cameo where you might have even just missed it, not even recognized him, because he's in such a small part of it. But in Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, you could argue he's a supporting role more than a lead. He kind of becomes the lead in the second half of the film. I would say when I first watched Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, it was A or B tier. After rewatching this thing many times, it has worked its way up to an S tier. I love it. It really does get better with each subsequent rewatch. Next up is Thirst. Thirst is Park Chan-Wook's take on a vampire film. It's pretty unique in the canon of all vampire cinema, which is kind of hard to do at the time that this came out when there had already been so many vampire movies. It's still a unique take on it. There's a lot of interesting things with the vampire mythos. Thirst starts off in like horror territory, as you would expect from a vampire film, but as it moves along, it kind of progresses into more of, it almost starts feeling like a superhero film. The superhuman abilities of a vampire, more than just, they're a monster that needs blood. It plays up like the super strength angle and stuff like that. So you have like almost superpowered like fight scenes and stuff toward the end, which is fun and interesting, but it did start kind of like losing me a little bit. I like the beginning of the film more than the ending. Actually, I love the very ending, but there's some stuff there's some stuff in the third act and toward the end of the second act that doesn't quite jive with me. It doesn't gel with me as much as the very ending and the stuff from the beginning. But there's great visuals all throughout. It is effectively gory in this kind of like nasty way that I really love. And again, Kang Ho-sung is so good. His performance in this is so distinctive and different from even just his other Park Chan-Wook collaboration, Like it's so different from Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. Completely different character. His his mannerisms, the way he carries himself, it's excellent. He's such a good actor. If there's one reason to watch Thirst, I would say it is for Kang Ho-sung's performance. Thirst for me, though, is kind of like C or B because it has its elements I don't quite like. They go in like superhero territory with it. Yeah, I'd put it in the B tier. I think that's where it deserves to be. I'm probably due for a rewatch on Thirst, just because I feel like watching it. Next up we have I'm a Cyborg, but That's Okay. This one has the weirdest title, and I would also call it, probably his weirdest movie. It's about a woman in a mental hospital who believes that she is a cyborg. This movie is like batshit crazy at times, but it's also like, it's just a ton of fun. And once you get past the like zaniness of it, it's a really heartfelt story. Like at the core, you have to kind of like dig past some of the like outward, just wild energy that it presents. But there's like a real human, dramatic center to this movie if you look for it, if you dig deep enough, and if you can stick with it past the facade that it puts up. Again, I would put it in the B tier. You could make a case for C tier, and I wouldn't push back too much, but I'm going to put it in the B tier. Next up is Oldboy, the middle film in the Vengeance trilogy and easily the most famous. I would guess it's still probably Park Chan-Wook's most famous film. The Handmaiden got kind of close because The Handmaiden definitely broke out to new audiences. It had an Amazon original like attachment to it, so that brought a bunch of new viewers into it. But I think Oldboy is still the one that's in the zeitgeist the most. It's remembered the most fondly. Oldboy is like a full-blown like classic at this point. I think it's beyond cult classic and just like a beloved cinematic jewel. Oldboy is like, it's one of a few films that I would call a perfect film. It does exactly what it sets out to do, and it goes so far above and beyond in every facet of filmmaking and performance. Let's not mince words with Min-Sik Choi's performance here. He gives one of the best performances in cinema. You cannot give enough credit to Min-Sik Choi's performance in this movie. It's excellent. Beyond just his commitment to the action sequence with the hammer, beyond his commitment to eating a live, raw octopus on camera, beyond all that, just the emotional depth that he conveys in this movie is astounding. And this movie easily gets the S tier. And now we move into the finale of the Vengeance trilogy with Lady Vengeance. Sometimes it is called Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, matching the Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, but most of the time it seems to just be called Lady Vengeance. All in all, I would call the Vengeance trilogy one of the best like movie trilogies out there. A lot of trilogies have a weak link. This one doesn't really. They're all very good. I would say Lady Vengeance is probably the weakest, and that mostly comes down to the script. The direction is fantastic. Visually, this movie is incredible. And you have another great Min-Sik Choi performance, by the way. He returned from Oldboy. It's an entirely distinctive performance as well. There's no like rehashing what Min-Sik Choi did so well in Oldboy. He's a small character, but he is again excellent in Lady Vengeance. All of my problems with Lady Vengeance come down to the script. The script's a little muddled. There's some playing around with chronology that I don't think works to the movie's benefit, and there are maybe a few too many characters. There are some characters who feel like they could be combined into one character, but instead they're actually like two characters or three characters. And it gets a little confusing to track all these different characters because some of them don't get all that much screen time, but they are still an important part of the plot. Those problems with Lady Vengeance do bring it down quite a bit from the two S-tier films. You could make a case for A tier or B tier or even C tier. For me, again, I think it's another B tier film. And B tier, let's be clear, is like an 8 out of 10 kind of thing. Next up is Stoker. It was his breakthrough to American audiences, or at least it was supposed to be. It was his first English language film. it wasn't very well received upon release. The critics were kind of like middling on it. Some people liked it, a lot of people didn't like it. It seems like the majority of people, right at release, because I remember when this came out and I was excited for it, then the reviews kind of turned me off of it a little bit. The reviews were very lukewarm at best, and it took me a while to get around to Stoker because the reputation just wasn't so hot. When I finally watched it, I greatly enjoyed it. The script was a lot weirder than what I thought it was going to be. The trailer does not do the movie justice. The trailer makes it seem a lot more straightforward than it is. There are some twists in this narrative that I greatly enjoyed and did not see coming. That being said, though, there are still quite a few drawbacks. I would say it is a little weaker than his Korean language films, but just a tiny little bit. Stoker is, I think, a little unfairly panned when it first came out. It's kind of like right between C and B, splitting that difference. And I'm going to put it in the C, but it's a strong C. You know, I'd say it's still worth watching if you're a fan of Park Chan-Wook. If you haven't seen any of his movies, then do not start with Stoker, though. Despite having a few great twists and really interesting like narrative kinks in other areas, the script is not up to that same standard. The script can get kind of poor at times, not to an overwhelming degree, but there are issues with it. Luckily, Park Chan-Wook's visual flair, and especially there's some really creative editing, those elements do elevate the poor script whenever the script dips like below par. Next up, we have Three Extremes. I reviewed Three Extremes as part of the 2020 Macabre Month of Horror, so check out my full review for more thoughts on that. In this video, I'll just say that Three Extremes is an anthology film where he directed one of the 3 segments. His segment is called Cut, and it's a team up with Lee Byung-hun, who he worked with previously in Joint Security Area. It's good. It's a good segment. Check out my review of Three Extremes for more thoughts on that. Three Extremes, he only did one segment of it, so I'm just going to rate his one segment, not the overall film. And that one segment, it's a C tier. I mean, it's a compressed runtime, so you can't do too much with it, but yeah, C tier is where it's going to land. Next up is The Little Drummer Girl. The Little Drummer Girl is a miniseries, actually. It's not a feature film. Chan-Wook Park directed every episode of this miniseries, which there are 6 episodes, I believe. This aired on both the BBC over in England and it aired on AMC in the United States. Before I even knew Park Chan-Wook directed this, I was fully on board just because it stars Michael Shannon and Florence Pugh and one of the Skarsgårds, one of them, Alexander. Oh, wow. His IMDb picture has him without pants on. Yeah, so I was on board for the cast of The Little Drummer Girl. Once I found out that Park Chan-Wook was directing it, then I was like, I could not wait to see this thing. So Park Chan-Wook was supposed to be directing an adaptation of an S. Craig Zahler script. It was his script that was on the blacklist for a while. The script was originally called The Brigands of Rattleburg. Then it got changed to The Brigands of Rattle Creek, because I guess Borg or Borge or whatever was too hard to pronounce or too unfamiliar a word. I don't know, I don't blame him. I love S. Craig Zahler's titles though. Brigands of Rattleburg is definitely more distinctive than Rattle Creek, but that's a tiny little change. I just want to see the goddamn thing. S. Craig Zahler's words, directed by Park Chan-Wook, that sounds incredible. But it seems like that might be defunct at this point. I don't know, it's been a long while since that news was announced. There was some talks of it being a Netflix original at one point. There was talks of it being like a multi-part miniseries. Some talks of it being a film. I really hope it happens because I definitely want to see it. Anyway, back to The Little Drummer Girl. I was really excited for this. I had high hopes. It let me down a little bit. It did not quite live up to those high expectations. It's adapted from a John le Carré novel. If you don't know, John le Carré is like the spy guy. Outside of Ian Fleming with James Bond, John le Carré is like the #1 spy guy. Like he wrote Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the one that's adapted from. He wrote the book that The Night Manager was adapted from, London Spy, all those like spy stories. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, I think. All of those like spy stories, a lot of them are John le Carré. The Little Drummer Girl, I would say, again, excellent on a stylistic point of view and from an acting point of view. Michael Shannon, Florence Pugh, and Alexander Skarsgård they're great. They all give excellent performances. But the thing is, I haven't read any of John le Carré's novels, so I can't speak to his like writing ability. But in a miniseries format here, maybe this story would have been better told as just a film, an 1.5 hour long film, or maybe a 2 hour film, because there doesn't seem to be quite enough material here for a 6 episode run of this show. The plot feels stretched so thin. There's a lot of filler, and that filler really does bring the show down a whole lot. If the talents of Park Chan-Wook in the director's chair and the cast were lesser, like if a lesser director and a lesser cast were given this material, I would call this like a bad miniseries on a writing level. But the talent involved does elevate it. Should have been a film, not a miniseries, but it's still worth watching if you're a fan of all of these people involved. It does feel so protracted. Everything is so drawn out. I gotta give it's like D or C tier, honestly, because it's so drawn out. I'll put it in the C tier. I would say it's, out of these 3 C tier films, it's the one closest to the D tier. And last up, we have The Handmaiden, not to be confused with The Handmaid's Tale. I know people have confused it just because they're similar titles. The Handmaiden was a pretty breakout film for Park Chan-Wook. Not that he was like a small fish or whatever before this, but this one seemed to hit a lot more like American audiences and just audiences in general outside of South Korea than a lot of his other films did. 2.5 hours is a perfectly valid runtime when a film is as gripping as this. When a script has this many brilliant little twists and turns and character moments and such strong performances and such a enveloping visual style, The Handmaiden is so well made. And it's one of the best scripts that Park Chan-Wook has brought to life with his incredible visual flair and directing talents. You could make a case for there being too many twists. It's definitely straddling that line of being like twisty for the sake of being twisty, you know, kind of like doing one too many. I think it just barely holds back from going overboard. Both leads are excellent. They're like really, really good. I think they both deserved Oscar attention, and neither of them got it, which is a shame because that the Academy doesn't recognize foreign language films as often. It's great that Parasite won. It's still a shame that The Handmaiden wasn't nominated. It's a shame that 3 Iron wasn't nominated, that Spring, Summer, Winter, Fall, and Spring wasn't nominated, that Oldboy wasn't nominated, you know. South Korea should have been dominating the Oscars for like years if the Academy wasn't so ethnocentric to Hollywood films in particular. The Handmaiden is a top-tier film. It's A or S. I kind of want to put it in A just because there isn't an A already, but I think it is an S-tier film. Anyway, that is our ranking of the Park Chan-Wook filmography. It's definitely crowded in the top half. He, just like Bong Joon-ho, I don't think he's made a bad film. I think his direction has always been excellent. Even in the projects that are a little weaker, it's usually the script that is the weaker part of it. The performances and direction are pretty much always top tier, come from him. He really brings the best out of his actors, it would seem. Check out Park Chan-Wook. Check out more of his films if you've only seen like one or haven't seen any. Definitely check out his films. Start with Oldboy. Work your way backwards. Thanks for watching. Check out my other tier lists. There's a playlist on the screen right now. Link is also in the description if you'd rather go that way for whatever reason. You don't like clicking on screen? Okay, click the description instead. Subscribe, stick around for more stuff. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.